right. Benjamin, is it your first time in Greece?
It is my
It is his first time. Welcome then, Benjamin. Benjamin Peterson. CPython governance, past, present, and future. Welcome, Benjamin. Welcome to Athens.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Kali Mara, good morning. Kali Mara, okay. I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers very much for inviting me. It's always great fun to travel around the world and see that even though we're separated by great geographic distances, we all still can be united by the Python programming language. I also really like the spelling of the conference title. It's very geeky. I like geeky. It does seem to me like something you would probably be using in a shell injection attack or some sort of, if you wanted to see how form validation was working on the server side or something, but I appreciate it. So this is a talk about governance of the CPython project. And since CPython is the reference implementation of Python, the first implementation and the one where all new language features land, this is also a talk about the governance of the Python programming language. So this is a topic which has become very interesting to people recently because there have been major changes. In particular, Guido van Rossum resigned as the benevolent dictator for life in the last year, and so we had to change how that governance worked in Python. But I want to make sure to take a holistic approach in this talk and talk about the history of Python, how decisions have been made in the past, and then indeed talk about how Guido's resignation has affected the community, and then finally speculate a little bit about what the future might hold for governance of the Python project. So first though, is that Guido says hello. He's always happy to hear about new Python conferences popping up all over the world. And a little bit about me. So I have been a core developer of CPython for 11 years now, since March 25th, 2008. And I'm really into nitty-gritty implementation details. I have not implemented like a lot of fancy, flashy language features that you might appreciate in Python. I like fixing like interpreter crashes, so we keep the interpreter not crashing, as Steve says it should. But I've also worked in various parts of the standard library, our own internal testing stuff, and infrastructure of the Python project, like our documentation server. Outside of CPython, I also wrote the 6 library, which is a Python 2 and 3 compatibility library, and almost everyone has a transitive dependency on that at this point. So that's about me. So let's dive into the content. Let's talk a little bit about the history of Python. So I've said that I've been a CPython developer for 11 years. It feels like a really long time to me, but Python is much, much older. Not as old as Steve, but still pretty old. So Guido said that he had the initial ideas for creating a Python language in December of 1989, around Christmas time. And at the time, he was working at a Dutch research institution called Centrum Wiskunde en Informatica, or CWI. And he was not supposed to be creating a programming language. He was supposed to be working on a new operating system called Amoeba. And Amoeba was going to be a great operating system. It was going to solve like all operating system problems. You know, it was a microkernel, and it would be great. So this is what he was working on. And Python, as it was originally used at CWI, was used to automate various tasks which they encountered during the development of Amoeba. Amoeba didn't really go anywhere. If you go and you look at the CWI website, they very proudly say at the top of their about page, "This is where Python was created," but they don't really say that they didn't intend that to happen. And So it was very useful at CWI, and then Guido publicly released Python in 1991. He broke up the tarball into like 18 different pieces and sent to a mailing list, because that's what you did in 1991. And so remember, this is the early 90s. This is before like 5 years before the term open source has even been invented. But Python already starts to be publicly developed in kind of an early open source model, even though the term didn't exist. So once it's released, Python gains significant popularity. And as part of that, Guido was invited to come work in the United States in 1995 at a place called CNRI in Virginia. And so he worked there for a few years, and around 2000, there was, of course, a lot of optimism in the tech center, many new companies, and so a bunch of Python core developers worked at a few very short-lived corporations, including one called beopen.com and the Zope Corporation, and so at this time, there were several Python core developers actually being paid to work on the language. But one thing which I found very interesting about the early 90s is that people were almost immediately worried about what would happen if Guido left the language. So there's this post from 1994 titled, "What if Guido was hit by a bus?" And the author of this email is worried that if Guido loses interest or dies, then Python will no longer be supported, and so businesses don't want to go involve themselves in things which are only supported by one individual. So this worry was expressed early. So this email also says businesses don't want to use languages that aren't standardized, so we need to propose the Python language to be standardized by ISO. So it turns out that the author of this thread really didn't need to worry, because Guido did not leave the project, and Python thrived even in businesses without the stamp of the ISO. But this is something that people have been worrying about for a very long time. And if you want to know more about the early history of Python, in particular the design of some of the fundamental features of the language, you should go have a look at python-history.blogspot.com. So this has a bunch of posts about from Guido about what he was thinking about during the early days of the language, and a lot of the sort of social history too. Around 2000, we gained one of the main features of Python development today, which is the Python Enhancement Proposal, or PEP. So a Python Enhancement Proposal is a document explaining what a particular feature or policy change is in the language or the CPython community, why it is we should have that feature or policy change, what problem is it solving, a explanation of what the other ways we could solve this problem is, and why the one proposed is the correct one, and a link to all the discussions about this particular issue. And historically, the way PEPs have worked is that once they're written, they're discussed on our mailing list, and then the ultimate decision about whether the PEP is accepted or rejected is made by Guido as the benevolent dictator for life. So in the last few years, we've also had a slight variation on that model where Guido delegates the authority for deciding on a particular PEP to someone else. And this is often using the case where Guido doesn't know a whole lot about the area, or someone else is clearly much more experienced and knowledgeable about a particular area. So a place where this is happened a lot is packaging. So Guido hasn't been involved in Python packaging very much, and so he's delegated the authority to accept or reject packaging PEPs to several other people. And the Python enhancement proposal model has largely been very successful. So in its less than 20 years in existence, there have been almost 500 PEPs written. And more broader than Python, many other open source communities, languages, projects have adopted the enhancement proposal model in order to guide the evolution of their projects. So that takes us up to about the present state of the world for Python. So there's no doubting that Python is a major programming language these days. Last year, TIOBE, which is this organization which tries to track the popularity of programming languages, once again gave Python their Language of the Year award, which means it's the programming language with the largest growth over 2018. So TIOBE tries to measure the popularity of programming language by checking the number of times people search things on the internet, which is kind of a questionable methodology, but there isn't one great way to know how widely used a programming language is. But besides that, we also know, as Steve demonstrated in this talk, just the vast places all over the world in every domain of computing where Python is used. So everything from education to agriculture to machine learning to web programming, Python is there. One thing that's very unique about Python being a major programming language, though, is that it's a completely community-driven project, the core language is. So there is, to my knowledge, no full-time core developer of CPython. So some people, such as GUIDO and a few other people, have arrangements with their employer to spend a little bit of their time, like a day, a week, just working on CPython stuff. But unlike, for example, the early 2000s, there's no core team or one company which is actually providing financial backing for the development of CPython. This is very unique because if you look at the other programming languages that are at the level of the Python, like C, C++, Java, JavaScript, they all have very large pockets behind them, but not CPython. And so that's how everything worked until this showed up. So this is lovingly called the walrus operator. And the walrus operator is part of PEP 572, assignment expressions. So we had a question about that earlier in Steve's talk, so I know some of you already know about this. But PEP 572 was a proposal to add an additional operator to Python, the walrus operator, which allows you to assign to variables within expressions. So traditionally, Python has had this very strict dichotomy in the syntax between statements and expressions, where you can really only assign new variables in statements rather than expressions. And PEP 572 is all about breaking down this dichotomy. It's best illustrated with some of the examples which are in the PEP. So here's a very simple one. So you see in the uppercase, in the before part, we're trying to read this environmental variable Python user base, and if it's there, then return early from our function. So in sort of classic Python, you have to assign the end base variable separately before you can check it in the if statement. But with PEP 572, with the walrus operator, you can assign env base at the same time you're checking whether it's a truthy value or not. And so that saves you a line of code. So this is perhaps a little more succinct, but it's not. It doesn't really seem like a killer feature yet. Where things get more convincing is when you have really nested if statements in pre-existing code. So this is a piece of code where we're trying to find a function called the reductor and then call it, and kind of depending on where we find it, we have to call it with different arguments. And so on the left-hand side, you have the current code, which is this kind of nested elf-if chain to try to all the fallback cases for finding and calling the reductor, which is kind of nested and a little complex looking, but it looks a lot flatter and cleaner and is several lines shorter under PEP 572, where we can actually assign the reductor in the expressions in the elf, if, and if statements. So that's kind of the general idea with PEP 572. How many of you think this is a good idea? Okay, so actually quite a few. So it seemed, if you judged by the mailing list threads, this was not actually a very popular idea, because this is a modification to syntax, and people feel very, very strongly about syntax of a language. And so people feel very emotional about it. And it's very likely that this idea would have died except that Guido van Rossum and Tim Peters signed on as co-authors of this PEP. So you know who Guido is. Tim Peters also is a very long-time Python developer. He's the one who wrote the Zen of Python. He invented a sorting algorithm for Python. So about as influential PEP authors as you could have. And so this gave the idea legitimacy, and there were massive discussions about PEP 572. There were sprawling threads with thousands and thousands of messages, which were way too big for anyone to comprehend. At some point, the PEP authors said, "Oh, we can't follow this anymore. The discussion is just too large." And because no one could follow the discussion, there was a lot of repetition in threads where someone would come up with some objection, which had already been handled in some other part of the messy discussion. And besides that, there was a lot of unpleasantness outside of the mailing list threads. So social media, in particular Twitter, has some special ability to bring out the worst of humanity, and very, very unkind, snide comments were being made about the PEP and this author. So kind of a culmination of the overwhelming discussion and just the pressure of handling this very sensitive issue partially led to Guido's announcement of June 12th, 2018, that he was stepping down as BDFL and taking a permanent vacation from the position. So this was pretty big news in the Python community. I think for a lot of us who have been working with Guido for a while, it wasn't completely unexpected. I remember listening to a talk in PyCon 2008 where Guido said, "I'm going to retire in 5 years," and that date came and went, as you can see. But it was still a momentous moment because this is the model which Python had been working under for 29 years and very successfully. And it was also impactful for the rest of the open source community and I guess software engineering at large, because almost everyone knows about Guido van Rossum and Python. It's so big that even the public media, the general media, noticed. My parents called me and asked, "What's wrong with Guido?" Because they had read in the news that he had stepped down. I think my favorite and some other people's was The Economist. So The Economist is this very snarky English news magazine, and they wrote an article about Guido stepping down, and they said, "He isn't the Messiah, but he was a very clever boy," which is about as complimentary as The Economist ever gets. So I think everyone interpreted that positively. All right, so first thing is the sky did not fall. People's programs written in Python still worked after Guido stepped down. Even in CPython, we still fixed bugs. We still made releases. We still had long design discussions. So all these things did not exactly require Guido to be serving as BDFL. And really, the only open question is who provides the moral leadership of the project and who is going to accept and reject PEPs. And Guido, in his resignation email, kind of threw down the gauntlet to the CPython community. He said, "I'm resigning. I'm not going to tell you how your governance is supposed to work now. You have to figure it out." And being CPython developers, we thought, we'll write a bunch of PEPs. So we did. We wrote a bunch of PEPs, and we had long discussions about governance issues. And so we did. We've already settled on one, but I want to take the opportunity to take you through a tour of a bunch of the governance PEPs that we came up with, so you can see what we were thinking about. So we assigned the governance PEPs a whole new PEP namespace in the 8000s. So the first one I'd like to talk about is PEP 8002, the Open Source Governance Survey. So this wasn't a governance proposal. This was a survey of the governance models that other open source projects have, and we wanted to find out a bunch of things. How do these models work? And in particular, we wanted to know, how do these communities resolve controversial decisions? So the PEP 572 discussions were all in the back of our minds when we were doing this, and we wanted to know how other communities have attempted to solve the problem of sustainable discussions on a large scale. So a bunch of open source projects were surveyed. There were even some companies which are surveyed. So in PEP 8002, there is a description of how Microsoft makes decisions, which is not the model we ended up adopting, but it was still interesting background. So first governance PEP proposal, PEP 8010, the technical leader governance model. So the central figure in PEP 8010 is someone called the gracious umpire influencing decisions officer, which sounds like word salad, except when you look at the acronym. Yes, so the GUIDO would be a basically replacement BDFL. They would be a singular leader who would accept or reject PEPs. They would be elected by the core developers and serve for 5 years. And there would be an advisory council which would not have any authority, but would help the GUIDO when they had difficult issues to ponder. So this was kind of the nostalgia model. Let's try to keep things the same as they were. But then we had PEP 8011, the trio of Pythonistas. So in this model, there would be a group of 3 people who would serve for 5 years, and they would be elected by the core developers. And sort of the idea is, rather than electing 3 separate people, you would elect groups of 3 people, and you would try to pick 3 people who complemented each other's strengths and weaknesses in decision making. So certainly a unique model. PEP 8012, the community governance model. So this one was based on how the Rust language community works. And sort of the basic idea, day-to-day work operation of this model is that there's self-selected working groups which sort of appoint themselves authorities on particular areas of the language, and then they're responsible for figuring out how to accept or reject PEPs which are in those areas. PEP 8013 is another kind of unique proposal where there's a council which holds the authority in the project to accept or reject PEPs, and it's elected by core developers, but the members of the council cannot be core developers themselves. So this means that people who did not really have any prior association with the CPython project would be holding the authority. And the idea is that you'd pick people who knew what a computer was, at least. And they would, since they didn't know that much about CPython, proposals to them would have to be detailed and convincing enough to convince someone who wasn't intimately familiar with the Python language. So an interesting idea. Then PEP 8014, the commons governance model. So this was also called the anarchy model because anyone who wants can vote on any PEP. And there's a council of elders, but they don't hold any actual decision authority. Their only role is to make sure that the anarchist voting is carried out in a stable manner. And so this is an interesting idea. It's also interesting because this PEP was written by Jaak Janssen, who was GUIDO's office mate at CWI, which gives you an idea that people besides GUIDO have been around the language for a very long time and are still active. PEP 8015, Organization of the Python Community. This is pretty similar to the community model where there's Python teams who are responsible for specific areas, the PEPs in those areas, and then there's a steering council which holds the ultimate authority, particular over team formation and the management and delegation of authority to them. All right, and then finally there was PEP 8016. So I will be talking more about this one in a minute. But after we had written and discussed all these proposals, we had to vote on them. And this itself was an incredible meta discussion. So it turns out that programmers love arguing about voting methods. So voting methods are great because you can prove that there is no perfect one. And so there's about 300 of them, and they all have their own disadvantages and advantages. So you get to pick one and then argue that yours has like slightly better advantages than everyone else's, and it's great fun to argue about. So we spent a long time discussing voting methods, but we did eventually decide on a voting method, and we did eventually use the voting method to decide on which PEP governance PEP we were going to use, and that one was the steering council model, the last one. And since it was the chosen one, it got bumped from PEP 8016 down to PEP 13. And this was kind of advertised as the very boring governance model. So it was inspired by what the Django project has, and the basic form is that there is a steering council of 5 people who are elected by core developers. They don't need to be core developers themselves. And they serve for a single feature release of Python, so that's like 3.7 to 3.8. And our current release schedule turns out to be about 18 months. And in an attempt to prevent Python from being dominated by one organization or company, there's a rule that no 3 members of the steering council can work at the same company. And the steering council, the PEP gives them basically complete authority insofar as they can have authority, so they can accept or reject PEPs, remove core developers, and basically make all project decisions. But the PEP encourages them to try to never use these powers, and instead they're supposed to work through community processes, consensus, and delegation and so forth in order to further the development of the Python programming language. So that's our new governance model, and since we needed to make a council, we had an election, and there were 67 voters, and quite a large percentage of them were also candidates. There were 17 candidates, and so we argued about the voting method of that too, and had our election, and here's the first steering council. So you'll probably recognize the first name here. So GUIDO is still very much around in the community. He just doesn't want to be on the critical path of all decisions anymore, but he's still involved. And the rest of these people are people who have been CPython developers for many years now and are going to bring a lot of wisdom and experience to the steering council. So thankfully they did not elect me. I got the 6th most number of votes. All right. So that's our new governance model, and now I get to talk a little bit about what the future might hold for the CPython project and a few topics on that order. So one of the large open questions in CPython governance, and perhaps even humanity, is how do you handle large-scale discussions where lots of people think they need to be involved over issues which affect a lot of people. So kind of the question is, everyone wants to know how to avoid a PEP 572 type of discussion anymore. And one of the thoughts is that mailing lists just aren't really that very good communication mechanism in 2019. And if we had tools that allowed us to better moderate discussions, better organize them, then there would be less redundant communication and so forth. So one thing we've been trying out is this tool called Discourse. So Discourse is kind of a fancy discussion forum software, and we've been using it for Python core developer discussions. So we had all of our governance discussions on Discourse. And the thing that we like about it is that it has a lot better moderation tools. So if there's an unproductive discussion, an admin can go and close a discussion and say, well, this was already answered here, or this is going off topic, please make a new thread. And so there's much better management for admins than you would have in a traditional mailing list. Another thing we've been looking at is kind of trying to further standardize our project infrastructure. So Python, since it's so old, has gone through like the entire gauntlet of version control and issue tracking systems. So we were on SourceForge ones. In my time, we've been on 3 different version control systems. Right now, we use our own bug tracker, which is using a system called Roundup, which I think we're the only people still in the world still using it. And so we've been looking into moving all of our issues onto GitHub. Our repositories are already there to further help people who are familiar with the GitHub workflow, which is very many developers now contribute to CPython. Yes. A few words about Python 3. So the state of Python 3 is looking very good now. There was a few years in like the 2012, 2013, 2014 times, just after Python 3 was initially released, where it didn't seem like Python 3 was getting much traction. There wasn't general availability of libraries that everyone was using in Python 3. People didn't seem to be that excited, but that's all completely changed now. Right now, you can do anything you want in Python 3, which you could do in Python 2. And I personally am just really, really sick of Python 2. I'm so tired of it. So Python 2, we're gonna make the last release of it in less than a year, and then we're gonna say a fond but firm farewell to Python 2, and not write any more of it, hopefully. And so I'm tired of Python 2. But I think the community is also really tired of Python 2. So one of my favorite websites these days is python3statement.org. And this is all sorts of libraries which people have committed to dropping Python 2 support once Python 2 goes end of life upstream. So that's in less than a year. And this has like all the big players in the Python community. There's almost surely a dependency there which you are using, and is going to drop Python 2 support next year. So it really seems like the community has moved on, and I really appreciate that. So I know a lot of companies and so forth are sitting on large legacy Python 2 code bases. I know about that, and you know these legacy Python 2 code bases may still be legacy Python 2 code bases in 2025. But what makes me feel better, sleep at night, is that I know that in 5 years there'll be large Python 3 code bases that are legacy. So success. That said. Python 3 was kind of a painful experience, and I think it's safe to say that given the current people working on the CPython project, we'll never ever try to do something like that again. We learned a lot of lessons about the pain of updating every piece of code ever written in a certain language in the world, and the value of backward compatibility. So it was a very valuable learning experience. Which brings me to a comment or two on the future of the core language. The future of the language is now technically in the hands of the Steering Council, which is a committee, and a committee should bring up horrible thoughts in your mind of like committee design and so forth, which is fair. Committees are often much more conservative than individual would be, and designed by consensus. And for example, I think it's a very good guess that if PEP 572 had been put before the council, it would not have been accepted. And it's just a very difficult task to think about replacing Guido and Rossum. He obviously knows everything about the history of the language and has a very well-tuned design sense for it. So he cannot be replaced. But I think it's less important that the core language evolve quickly these days. So right now, if you start using Python, you probably don't go sit down and say, I'm going to start using Python. You say, I'm going to start using TensorFlow, or I'm going to start using Flask, or SciPy, or any other of these wonderful things which the Python ecosystem has built. So the real killer feature of Python these days is not the language. It's everything that everyone else has written in Python, that all those worlds which Python can open up to people. So a lot of people chose to write these things in Python because they liked Python, but the core language is now just kind of a framework where you can hang any sort of task that you want to do. And so it's not really that important that the language is constantly getting fancy, flashy new features, because it's not the most important thing to be changing a lot now. And with that, I will conclude and yield to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. I think we have some questions. We'll jump straight into them before we have our break. Here we go. What's your secret sauce?
Well, I really like hot sauce. That's pretty good. I guess Professor Spinellis, that's his name, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Is he here today? Is he here today? Not yet.
Well,
no. Okay.
and if when he answered that question, like, what's the most important programming skill for a software engineer, and he said, like, curiosity. I completely agreed with him, and I don't know if I've actually achieved that much, but I've certainly spent a lot of time like digging around in various pieces of source code and like trying to solve obscure race conditions, and I think I really agree with what he said about how technology changes quickly, and you have to constantly be curious and willing to learn more. And not even within Python, like any kind of technology. I think we're very lucky to be living in a time when software engineering is still pretty young, and so you can become a software engineer and you don't have to specialize in one really specific area. You can basically learn how to program anything, and so you should take advantage of that. Why not Python 2?
Should we skip that one?
I see there are trolls in Greece too. Yeah.
Okay. PEP 8014. Can you elaborate more why was this rejected?
Can you remind me which one that was? I don't remember.
Who remembers PEP 8014? I had it open on my laptop there a second ago, but who put the question up? Say again? The anarchy, the commons model. I think there were, as you saw, a lot of PEPs which were kind of unique, but we weren't really interested in. We wanted something which looked like it worked for other communities. We didn't really feel like this was a time to innovate in governance models, partially because we just didn't have a huge amount of experience in managing open source communities which weren't run by Guido van Rossum. What do you love and what do you hate about open source projects?
Wow, there's a lot of both. Almost everything I learned about software engineering, I learned in open source. So I really appreciate the focus that most open source projects have on just quality and sort of the art of software engineering. I learned a huge amount from that, and I like having the source being open. So I've learned a huge amount just by reading various open source projects.
but I mean, there's a real problem in open source of I guess the term for it now is sustainability, where people develop projects for fun on 1 week, and then large companies start using it and depending on it and filing issues, and even maybe even contributing code, sending pull requests and patches and so forth. But all of those things, it has to be acknowledged, as generate work on the upstream author, and sometimes we forget that those people have no obligation to even still be there. So we were very I think a lot of work that people do in open source ends up being exploited widely, and not the rewards don't really shift back to the creators all the time.
There's one there. Will tail recursion be included in CPython ever? And then I have one final one.
Okay, probably not. I mean, tail recursion is kind of a minor optimization in a non-functional language like Python. And if we were to implement tail recursion, probably the way to do it would be to have like a tail keyword or something, so that you know you are explicitly taking advantage of this optimization. Implicit tail recursion optimization is kind of a strange thing, even in things like C. Whereas if you like slightly change how one call site happens, then you'll lose it, and maybe you'll start overflowing your stack. So it's also a kind of a language and least surprise principle. Explicit is better than implicit. Thank you.
And one final one from me, if I may.
Of course.
You described the governance model. Do you envisage at some point that societies might choose to have governance models which are related to the way open source projects are governed? I mean, you described a number of things in there that can prohibit a bit of corruption, et cetera, but how soon do you think our democratic models, and Steve earlier mentioned the word, we're in the birthplace of democracy. Do you see that ever happening?
Oh.
Can it apply to societies of millions of people versus thousands or hundreds of thousands of developers?
I would be really worried about that, because as I said, I think it's still a very open question about how you get just hundreds of people to move in the same direction and not fight, much less like entire countries. And so we can't really even solve our like tiny governance problems. And politics is the art of doing this on the large scale, right? And we've been working at that for 2,500 years, and we're still not really that good at it. And trying to get people to work together in a productive, and open source projects have some advantages over a general country, right? Because it's people who are all at least committed to making Python great, that have something together. Whereas it's hard to achieve even that kind of uniformity and purpose in larger, more heterogeneous bodies.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Thank you for your talk. Fantastic.